This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brem. As we near the end of 2025, it's time to take stock of the year. What were the big events this year, and how might they impact the field of comparative education? What new ideas emerged, and where is our field headed in 2026? Continuing this long-standing tradition, Susan Robertson and Mario Novelli join me for the last episode of the year. Susan Robertson is a professor of education at Wolfson College at the University of Cambridge, as well as at the University of Manchester. Mario Novelli is a professor in the political economy of education at the University of Sussex. They co-edit the journal Globalisation, Societies, and Education. Susan Robertson and Mario Novelli, welcome back to FreshEd.
So thank you so much, Will. It's so wonderful to connect with you again and do this amazing annual roundup of the state of the world, and what a turbulent world it is.
Yeah, great to be with you, Will.
It's, I guess, celebratory in the sense that FreshEd reached the 10th anniversary this year, and this is the 10th time that we are doing this special year in review. And Susan, you've been here for all 10, and Mario, you've been here for 6 of them now. So thank you very much for such commitment to FreshEd.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
So this year, 2025, has been turbulent. We got to start with Trump, as much as I hate doing it. But, the Trump administration shut down USAID, but many Western governments have reduced their spending on aid and development, which often includes education. I guess to start to make sense of this year, how should we make sense of these changes in education?
I think one quote comes to mind. There are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen, often attributed to Lenin. It does feel like this year has been highly transformative. You talked about international development assistance. OECD estimates a drop of around 17% in 2025. US leading the way, but Germany, the UK, not far behind in the depth and breadth of cuts. The area that I work in, education and emergencies, in a time when we have more wars and conflicts than any time since the Second World War, we're talking about a 33% cut in funding to education in conflicts and protracted crisis. So massive shifts. The closure of USAID, a real kind of almost existential, I think, threat to definitely US development projects, but also a kind of questioning of the whole development project. Not from the left, which, since Black Lives Matter particularly, a big internal critique of the kind of white savior and quite imperialist development project, but from the right with very different logics about look after your own first and let's move away from this kind of any notion of a kind of liberal humanitarian world. So implications I think are massive, but I also feel that we shouldn't get into this kind of presentism that says Trump, Netanyahu, the two biggest problems in the world. Get rid of those two and we can go back to this beautiful liberal order, because both Netanyahu and Trump were the products of decades of injustices, inequalities. They weren't the kind of transformatory process. So I just feel like we're in that kind of phase of, let's say the ugly face of US-led global capitalism. But there were many prettier faces that paved the way for these two characters to kind of come into the global thing. And so, in a sense, I feel like I'm getting into lots of debates of kind of with colleagues that lament a kind of glorious rule-based liberal order, and I just can't find the evidence for it in history.
Mario, I agree with you completely. And if you're in the reading kind of politics, international relations literatures, there's a fascinating debate going on and some very nice pieces that have also come out around, there was never a liberal international order. It was a deeply illiberal order. And much of the reading I've been doing over the last 6 to 12 months has kind of been reading that literature. The activities of the CIA, coming out of the 50s and 60s. And again, deeply, deeply illiberal. So that's, I guess, the first point. Probably in that broader literature, those who were attached at the hip as part of this pretense at being a liberal democratic order, neither liberal nor democratic actually. But it has opened up some interesting scholarship around, what are we looking at? Achaya talking about a multiplex world. You'll look at the other groups talking about poly-alignment or, multi kind of sets of alignments where there's a foot looking east and a foot kind of still unsure and attached also to the United States. And, my sense probably where I feel it's this kind of radical shut-off of US aid is that it did also, though, hurt locals in spaces where there were wages to be made, families to be looked after and so on. So that kind of radical, while the left might say, fantastic, this is what we always kind of wanted, it's also had its casualties very significantly. And I don't think we should, overlook that in that sense. These are innocent, it's the collateral damage to innocent people who've been caught up in a world that's been organised around a set of alignments that came out of the Second World War. It's a fading kind of world, but it's a very, as Gramsci says, the old is kind of dying. But, in that moment of dying, it's kind of the death throes are pretty awful and pretty violent actually at the moment too.
I think that's right. It's not celebrating in any way, but just recognizing the seeds that were laid in the liberal order for the production of these and not trying to kind of say that the current year is an aberration. But I was also thinking, we're coming up almost to 25 years of the history of the journal, and the journal itself emerged out of the theorization of a particular moment in global history, the globalisation, and particularly neoliberal globalisation. And we are at a moment when we're all having to rethink, both broadly but also educationally, what kind of world order, what kind of economic system, what kind of society are we describing now, and what are the implications of that? And I think that the drivers of neoliberal economic theory and neoliberalism have kind of met a kind of political moment where there's a kind of authoritarian neoliberalism emerging, which is entering very much into the cultural domain. And you feel it in education, you feel it in the culture wars, you feel it in the closing down of curriculum, you feel it in attacks on academic freedom. So it's a really my sense is that the right has got its act together in a cultural project, in a Gramscian kind of way, and are really entering into lots of areas. And, we also need to speak back to that, analyse it, but also think about how we can challenge some of those things.
What would that mean for your journal? I mean, that's quite a fascinating insight that, 25 years ago when the journal was sort of created, it was a very different geopolitical moment. And the ideas that journal was responding to might not exist or look differently today. What does that mean for the journal, right? How do we intellectually, as academics, what does the journal look like or should look like to address these contemporary issues and challenges and new structures in geopolitics?
Well, I think it depends on how you want to think about globalisation. And in the very early years, we interviewed Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and his conception of globalisation is one that I've always found the most compelling. And so we could talk about the globalising of a kind of liberal authoritarianism. So it's where there's kind of something that starts in a location, and we can find those locations. Quinn Slobodian's recent book called Hayek's Bastards is a must-read. And there are several locations, Freiburg, for example, Hayek, but in fact his project starts to become a slightly different project. But the one that also takes root in the United States, Rothbard reaching up to von Mises and others. And that is a kind of fascist-oriented form of neoliberalism. So if we then stay with Boaventura's understanding, then essentially it's not the global versus the national, which is a scalar understanding. If you think of the outward movement and that tries to remove anything that's local and declares it as, alien or out of place and so on. And one asserts the right to present itself as the only and unique understanding of the world. In that sense, and that's what's guided the journal all through this period of time, that understanding of globalisation means essentially that it's a process that's been with us for many, centuries. We could see the expansion out of Confucianism, for example, as following that kind of patterning. The expansion out of, modernity, Enlightenment thinking. Now it's meeting other civilizational ideological kind of projects and so on. So and we're not the only journal, for example, Global Social Policy, Globalizations, Global Network, Globalization Societies and Education. But what we do want to do, I think, is for our 25th celebration, so perhaps we're putting this out there now, we'll be making a call for small, maybe 2,000 word pieces around all different kind of facets that we think have made up the last 25 years, reflections, and enable us, if we collect them together in all of their kind of full of contradictions but some things that have been potentially globalized we might want to stay with as well.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking, Susan, that when the journal started, although, we did have, Santos and recognitions that there were multiple globalizations, but quite rightly, we were very much focused on the hegemony of the US emerging out of the collapse of the Soviet Union and a period of neoliberal expansion, the kind of neoliberal globalization. And we're moving now, and I did a piece for IJED a couple of years ago on where I talked about this kind of shift from Pax Americana to Pax Pluralis. And I guess that pluralis is what we've been talking about, multiplex governance or different ways of talking about that, but a range of different actors. And, if I think for me, one of the things that I think we need to do is understand a bit more of those actors that we haven't focused so much on. So let's not just focus on the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF. Let's look at what China is doing, what Turkey is doing, what philanthropic organizations are doing, what corporate organizations are doing. Let's have a look at them. Let's open that up. Let's try to understand what are the political projects emerging from these different institutions and organizations, and what are the implications for education for that. I think that gives us a lot of scope in the future to move forward in globalization society.
A good example are the development banks that have been set up in China and aligning with the BRICS. Or, let's look at UNESCO, and UNESCO now being funded, the biggest funder of UNESCO is now China and Japan after that. And that sets in motion quite different kinds of politics. It does mean that our ethnographic work might have to be different and negotiated and so on. But that's the project, and I know later on probably we get likely to talk about what does it mean to think, in a world where we've got other important players. Yeah, so Mario, I do agree with you. I think getting others into the frame as part of our analysis for GSE. I think GSE has always been pretty good about doing that. We've actually published when other journals have kind of said no, whether it's to do with length or to do with focus or, too much of a reach out into kind of global or political economy and so on. And I feel very proud of the journal that, in fact, actually it's really prioritised, good, rigorous geopolitical, geoeconomic kind of analyses in what it's actually done. And probably we could do more on the cultural front.
That bringing up China is quite interesting here because I think, it's like on the one hand, the state of China is heavily investing in the sort of Western institutions of development like the UN, UNESCO. But at the same time, they're also sort of creating new institutions that might serve their own purposes, like these global initiatives, or like the Global Governance Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative. I think the last one of Global Governance Initiative was released and launched just in September of this year. So it's a relatively new project in a way, as well as like the Belt and Road Initiative, which sort of had a big launch maybe a decade ago, and then it sort of declined a little bit. And now we're seeing new deals struck between China and the Belt and Road Initiative and different countries in the global south. It's a fascinating world. I mean, that might just simply be an example of this multiplex, multipolar world where we're seeing all these new institutions emerging at the same time that the old institutions continue to exist but are being reshaped. And it's a really sort of fascinating moment. And China, of course, is a major player, and I think going to be a increasingly major player in this space. But I would love to just know how you're thinking about China in particular, because it just seems like, that is the elephant in the room when it comes to education, international development, comparative education. It just seems like it has so much weight because of its funding, because of its sheer size, because of its influence over so many countries across Asia and Africa at this point.
But it may also do development differently. I mean, you're absolutely right that China, we do need to understand China, and it's incredibly important that we don't read China through the eyes of the West. And to also, if one can, to potentially kind of be there, to talk with people. There are also very good commentators on China. For example, Lee Jones and Shahar Hamiri's book, Fractured China. And what they caution people about is too much of a kind of a sense of, there's degrees of plurality and degrees of fracturedness in China that mean that things don't quite work in the way in which we often imagine they're going to work, or we're told that they're going to work, And I'm not blind to the fact at the moment there's a kind of ratcheting up of AI nationalism to kind of second Cold War, etc. I was speaking at a conference in China in early November, and it was remarkable the lack of presence of any US-based academics speaking there. Many other people from different parts of the world. So, and you're right, the Belt and Road, it was launched by President Xi in 2013. But what happened at that point for universities, for instance, is they were tasked with kind of coming up to making it work. It wasn't top down. It wasn't, and yet I have no doubt there are degrees of surveillance, as there is everywhere. You wouldn't want to think that surveillance is only happening in one place, Just chatting today, Trump's kind of out for anyone's social media accounts right at the moment, and this program, the airing of this and a discussion on Trump, is likely to be kind of picked up by the security technologies that people like Peter Thiel and Palantir have been advancing, that have actually been used on US campuses to detect who was actually active on social media and so on. So we also need to be trying to study those kinds of developments. What does it mean for education? What does it mean for schools, universities, and in different parts of the world? We are entering periods, and I'm reminded Einstein, I've just gone back to looking at the statements that people like Einstein were making, a group of 4 of them actually, in reaction in about 1917, coming out of the First World War. And they began to worry about this combination of security, technology, and the potential for a rising fascism, nationalisms, and so on. I think that's the moment we're in. It will look different in different parts of the world, but that's a very lethal combination, says Einstein. And again, some contemporary scientists worrying about the same kind of a thing, that lining up of powerful technologies that include surveillance mechanisms, rising nationalisms, and a kind of a rising sentiment of really confrontation. I think that's kind of what ties it all together.
Listening to some of the issues that you're articulating makes me kind of reflect that on the one hand, we look at China. Okay, China clearly is the new emergent hegemon that is expanding its reach. But it's not alone in terms of states that are expanding their influence and reach, some regionally, some globally. So we think about India, and we can also think about Hungary and its links with the far right and movements across the world. Turkey increasingly expanding its influence. Israel over the last 2 years moving into Syria. Lots of expansionist states, but also other actors with state-like powers and characteristics. No, so Yanis Varoufakis' work on techno-feudalism is an example of that, of these incredibly powerful corporate actors, incredibly powerful billionaires that have massive amounts of influence. You touched on Palantir, but, there are a whole range of different actors involved in having really huge influence in these kind of domains of global governance. And then we also have this phenomena. My colleague here at the Al-Qasimi Foundation, Rui da Silva, he read my paper on from Pax Americana to Pax Pluralis. And he says what about from Pax Americana to Pax Narcissus? These egomaniac kind of self-centered, no better epitomized than Trump's exchanges with journalists these days at the White House, of these really strong, self-confident, arrogant leaders who are kind of ripping up the rule book of normal conduct and doing as they please. No, I don't know the evidence completely for the relationship between the tariffs and the number of golf courses that will emerge in different parts of the world over the next year, and who's having their reductions in tariffs in relation to relatives of the Trump regime as they travel around the world. But these things give one a sense of the end of the kind of papal empires, the Borgias, the kind of corrupt leadership of the US empire that is just grabbing whatever it can for its personality as Rome burns.
Yeah, Mario, I mean, the point on narcissism is quite fascinating. And in many ways, it's not simply the leaders of certain countries. It's all of us. Right. And there's a lot of really interesting philosophy being written around this. Like Byung-Chul Han, for instance, has talked a lot about how there's something called positive power, where you are being happily controlled by the social media algorithm because you love posting, you love liking, you love to be involved in it. You want to create yourself as a personal project that can sort of fulfill greatness. But in fact, you're actually being completely controlled by these different algorithms, these different big non-state actors that you were talking about. And the worst part is that we love it. We absolutely love doing it. That's a real change in how power operates. It's no longer that sort of Foucauldian notion of, we know someone bad is standing in the middle of the panopticon, so we're then going to change our behaviors. In the digital panopticon, we love participating in this, right? So it's a fascinating sort of like, it's not just our leaders, it's a lot of us. And so maybe the leaders are actually just reflecting who we are, right? The polity themselves, which is a scary idea, I think. But let me go back to another thing that you sort of brought up about these non-state actors, because I think, one of the big ones that I see really taking hold is asset managers. And you see a lot of Western development agencies sort of, in this moment when state government funding to development is declining, and, all of these notions of like the gap in how much financing we need to achieve the SDGs, the element, the actor that's stepping in to say we can fill this need are these asset managers, are creating the idea that projects can be investable and create a return on investment. And you see people like John Kerry talking about it. You see people at the World Bank talking about it. It's becoming so commonplace. The International Finance Facility for Education, this is how they talk about it. You do more with less, but the idea is that the money that is being invested is private capital that demands returns in the future. And when I look at this, I just see like the League of Nations happening all over again, where you have private bondholders basically having the most power in the international order. And they're the ones that are, developing Greece or developing China, whatever it was in the 19th century. And I just see like this is repeating again. And maybe it's, the last gasp of this neoliberal globalization, but it's interesting when you shine a light on this non-state actor of asset managers.
I mean, I guess that's not surprising in many senses, but I mean, Gabor, who also writes on some of this, also talks about de-risking. And so I think we've probably got to get a little bit closer in of how much is a further extraction of state resources, assets. And then I'm kind of thinking, what then is being extracted? So let's take, for instance, health data. That's an asset. Okay. And it's an asset that's owned actually by the state. And the NHS here in the UK is under huge pressure to continue to finance itself by actually selling off, if it can, or it's certainly letting quite a lot of it go for a certain kind of return. So this idea of we've got money, and this is surplus money. It needs, capitalism works through generating profits. And if you've got money swirling around, even in tax havens, it's not doing anything quite. So they need to invest it, and they need a discourse around investment. But it also comes with a discourse around de-risking. And what that should do is alert us to the fact that if essentially the asset managers are also never going to take the hit on the risk. And they never did on PPPs. And this is just the same kind of language, packaged up differently and after different kinds of assets, actually. And one asset we might want to talk about here would be extracting, and is all of the data and skills that are being generated by, the AI activity in classrooms, for instance, or adding to the health data that's being generated. Many of the developed economies are actually services economies. So what does one gather together in terms of data as sets of assets that enables one to, follow patterns to do with health, drug usage, then using that to advertise, all that kind of thing. So perhaps I want to counter this idea of, the corporate world is, and the asset managers are wanting to do well in the public sector. They want to extract more from the public sector. But the form of that extraction, the asset itself, is taking a different form.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And, in a sense, this is continuity as well, no? So we've talked about decades of neoliberal economic theory. We've talked in the social sciences about economic imperialism, that economics enters in, and clearly in the development sector now, we've seen that. We've seen it with social impact bonds and other kind of financial mechanisms, so bring market logics into development projects. But we've also seen the appearance of many more corporate actors, philanthropic actors within the development governance, the global governance of international development. As the state retreats, more of these actors are in. And I think it raises exactly the same questions as Susan is talking about. Are these actors there filling the gaps of the demise in state funding, or are they there to extract extra profits, extra influence to push development, to push activities in certain directions? How can we unpack these things? There are just so many kind of examples of the way that we, in a sense, we've come to a hyper neoliberal period where many of the kind of wet dreams of this neoliberals of the 1990s have come to fruition. But then there is also a realization that the world is in a mess. Massive amounts of conflict, massive amounts of inequality, massive amounts of unmet needs, And you kind of feel like the contradictions are so very evident in so many domains of social and economic and political life now that they may be at their apex, or they may be at their end, or maybe they get out of it again, like we've talked about so many times, the kind of capacity for neoliberalism to reinvent itself in different forms over the years. So, it's certainly not boring, the world these days.
Can I just add one thing, Will? And I think we do see the exhaustion of what Jessup might have called the Schumpeterian, post-national workfare regime. And a couple of colleagues and myself are writing on what we're calling the Galbraithian regime. So John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist, a heterodox economist largely, often dismissed by orthodox ones as being too sociological. But what was he doing through that period of the 50s and 60s? He is actually tracking through that period the rise of the military kind of industrial kind of complex, the distribution or redistribution of resources into universities to power the Cold War. He talks about the rise of oligarchic power and so on. There's a lot in there for us to really think with right now, because we've shifted really from a kind of Schumpeterian regime, or shifting, not everywhere and not at the same pace and so on. But there is something about a Galbraithian regime right now that is emerging that has all of the elements, I think, of something distinctively different, powered by the same kind of commitments to economy over, polity, erasures of democracy where it suits you, etc. But I think there's something in there.
And he's also a very good writer, and he has these beautiful descriptions of like everyday life as he's traveling around the US. So highly recommended to go back and revisit his work.
Private wealth and public squalor. That's what he describes, yeah? That's what we're looking, or public precarity. Those two things, That sums up the experience for many.
Yeah, just if I may, Will, just reflecting on that, because I'm here now in the UAE, I began my year in the US giving a speaking tour around Gaza, scholasticide in the US, talking about some of those issues from Gaza. And now being here, it's made me reflect a little bit about which societies, which countries are moving forward and which are moving backwards. And, I kind of feel in my own country, in the UK, that we're crumbling, eroding. My own institution lost 350 staff in June, just announced another several hundred redundancies. The university feels like it's in an existential situation. And then you come here to the UAE and you see buildings going up everywhere. So it's these kind of contrasts of some parts of the world developing, some parts of the world crumbling, and within each of those spaces, massive amounts of inequalities as well, that mask, beautiful skyscrapers and massive inequalities in terms of labour rights, in terms of salaries in the UAE. You talk about the UK, that although lots of us feel really under the cosh, many people are doing really well out of the crisis. So there are all those kind of contradictions that are spanning the globe as we reflect on this year.
Another contradiction that I sort of think about is in terms of climate and, the climate crisis, which I think we probably brought it up in every single episode that we recorded over 10 years. And it's sad to realize not much has changed. But the contradiction that I think, at least for me, that 2025 made clear is, on the one hand, you have this generative AI boom. Susan, you brought it up earlier, and it seems to just be everywhere now. And the amount of emissions and water that these data centers need to power the ability for Google to tell me, what's probably right on some stupid question that I type into my Google search. And the amount of energy that takes is just sort of disheartening. And we kind of lose it in this rhetoric of what AI is doing. But then on the other hand, we have, 2025, I think, was the first year when China reduced its emissions overall, and outside of COVID, when that was a strange time when everyone stopped moving, and so you have like this moment where you start thinking, is it the strong state of China and the model that it's using to reduce its carbon emissions, is that what it's going to take? And is this craze of data centers that's happening in 2025 just sort of, we're losing sight of what we need to do?
I've talked quite a lot about this. I mean, I do also know that there are efforts, and in places like China, to think differently about how these data centers are actually working. Can they be sustainable? Can you use some of the kind of heated water, which is part of the cooling process, to actually generate heat and so on for cities and towns and that kind of thing? And, so you can actually begin to see that there could be some synergistic or some ways in which you can reduce that level of extraction, use of water resource and things like that. The bit that was really kind of quite dramatic about, DeepSeek, for example, is that it used, I think, something like 1/10 of the energy to do a search. And I often myself use DeepSeek as the preferred search engine for sustainability reasons. Now, those are the kind of conversations that we also need in classrooms and so on. And yet it's interesting, and I'm going to just dive slightly into thinking about, well, where would be the automatic place to begin to work with young people in classrooms or in universities, to do with UNESCO, but the OECD developing these AI frameworks and so on. And Michele Martini and myself just finished a paper analysing these frameworks. On the one hand, UNESCO, and on the other hand, the OECD, the European Commission, and lots of kind of private actors and so on. And one of the things that we're finding, despite the fact that actually, let's say, a critical engagement pedagogically in a classroom might be to have these more robust discussions around, the political economy or even a kind of territorial economy of where are these data centres, how do they work, what were their water usages, where do they go into, neighbourhoods where you get now forms of huge sucking up of water and the neighbourhood itself is actually finding it doesn't have adequate access to proper water and those kinds of things. But to our dismay for the moment, our reading, very close reading of the work that we're kind of producing, shows us that, in fact, actually, for the OECD, teachers get a raise, they're taken out of the equation, and yet you need teachers in there to actually motivate, to facilitate, to inject into these conversations with young people all of those kind of questions and concerns around its affordances, but also how does it work and what's its economy and, what are the issues around new forms of coloniality and so on. So I want to put those things together really because that's where the education world potentially kind of intersects. And, really call for, we talk about AI, but actually what we're really, it's just become another word for the digital. And the danger of using a word like AI is that it covers up all kinds of things. We're really actually talking about machine learning. And while it's fast, we've become almost overwhelmed and somewhat, hysterical about the fact that it's so fast. But it's fast because of the way in which these data centers are able to rapidly kind of produce information and so on. But we should not be under any illusion sort of underneath there that this is machine learning, and it also kind of comes at a cost, and some of that cost I believe is once it moves to standardization, when it moves to data reduction as it does, when it moves to thinking about reducing complexity and so on, is that what it's also doing is removing the kinds of conversations from classrooms and universities that actually make much more visible the way in which those kinds of economies actually work. So I'll finish there, but I think that's the big conversation that I'd like to see take place in 2026.
Yeah, there's so much in there and there's so much to talk about kind of, what's the new mode of governance that is successful in the challenges that we face today. The globalisation literature, part of that was about nations needing to engage in common problems that couldn't be resolved individually by nation states. No, so HIV being one, climate crisis being another, AI now being another, and we're seeing at the moment a collapse in those international treaties, international engagements, international agreements in so many domains. And it's precisely at this moment that when the world is faced with so many existential threats that we should be coming together, that should be modes of communication and dialogue, and these things are being blocked. And so, I think that's where we have to look as academics to try to create these spaces of dialogue, to be able to be engaging across borders and to challenge some of these issues. And, the case of AI and climate crisis and the links between the two would be one perfect topic and theme to explore. And there are many others. I often think about, what's the role of academia in a time when our leaders have given up sense of responsibility for many of the things that we believe in. Maybe we have a particular role now to step up and to speak out and to engage, because there are so many challenges, but they seem to be cast away. And the retreat from the climate crisis is one example of, it's like the US is leading the retreat, but there are so many countries running behind them saying, let's renege on our agreements now. Somebody's reneged, so therefore we have justification to do it too. And we're kind of turning back any sense of potential of progress. And, we saw that in the recent COP in Brazil, that it kind of finished with a whimper rather than any bold pronouncement that, we really need.
So 2025 was not a dull year. And what we've been talking about, each of these topics could sort of take up an hour conversation, an hour podcast. But as we come to the end of this year, what are you looking forward to for next year? What's on your radar for 2026?
Perhaps, Mario, I might suggest on my radar is really the academy feeling, though it's under a huge amount of pressure, some of the intellectual leadership has to come out of the academy, the university. And I'm looking forward to ways in which we can progress that. I mean, I see lots of things happening in the university that I'm at the moment, the University of Manchester, and I see amazing conversations and good work. And you see, young people also in there and concerned. You look at, I have no clue how it's going to go, but social media, for example, has been cut off for young people in Australia. Some of them actually saying, well, that's not fair because this is how they get political education. And they've got a case up in the High Court and they may well be successful. But that's really quite an interesting debate that they're also raising about where are the spaces for learning about politics and learning about how to, be civically engaged. I don't want to engage in a politics of despair. I think amazingly human beings, perhaps what I'm looking forward to really, I've been following scientists like physicists who, Carlo Rovelli, for example, an amazing scientist, very political though. And you kind of feel that when the scientists themselves start worrying about and reading and linking politics, the physical scientists like the physicists, politics with science and issues of democracy and confrontation. I think there are debates that need space to be aired, and we know that they're being closed down in certain kinds of spaces. But I kind of look at some of the work that some of the doctoral students, postdocs, undergrads are doing, and I feel buoyed by that. And I think it's really important not to feel as if we're completely trodden on and being erased. There's lots to feel buoyed about, and we should just hold on to that and look at the different ways in which we can get those voices kind of out there.
That's a good point. And I think, we didn't talk in this about the last year that there's been a number of Gen Z revolts. We've seen Bangladesh, we've seen Nepal. Let's hope that the year 2026 is a year of rebellion against many of the injustices, the emergence of new, diverse forms of internationalism that can bring a challenge to many of these. On a more micro thing, I think probably if you look through our journal, you'll see we do a number of special issues, an amazing special issue on Edward Said, the last one of this year. And we have a new special issue coming out on learning from higher education in conflict and crisis, co-edited by Helen Murray, Birgül Kutan, Samuel Bodma, Sava Holeta, and Sardar Sadi. An absolutely fantastic special issue. 25 articles, the biggest special issue the journal's ever done, and massive amounts of work and labour. But, also evidence is the kind of commitment of scholars from all around the world working in difficult contexts, speaking out, organising, raising their voices. And so I think, from the micro to the macro, let's hope that 2026 brings some progressive, radical social change in the midst of all this darkness that we've had for the last few years. And of course, a just resolution in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, and there's so many parts of the world where there are violent conflicts taking place.
Well, Susan Robertson and Mario Novelli, thank you again for joining FreshEd. Happy New Year, and I look forward to talking to you in 2026.
Thank you so much, Will. See you in 2026.
Yes, thanks, Will. Always a pleasure to be in the presence of you and Susan. Let's do this again next year.
Susan Robertson is a professor of education at Wolfson College at the University of Cambridge, as well as at the University of Manchester, and Mario Novelli is a professor at the University of Sussex. They co-edit the journal Globalisation, Societies, and Education. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Ngunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements, and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORAG, the Shakdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next year.